On a winter evening, sometime around 2018, a quietly spoken man in his late 60s stood in a village hall in Wiltshire, addressing a small crowd on behalf of a military mental health charity. His name was Mark Aston, callsign Splash, and he was describing, in flat, measured tones, things he had never spoken about publicly for nearly 4 decades. Helicopter crashes on an Antarctic glacier, a midnight raid to destroy 11 enemy aircraft, a sea king ditching into the freezing South Atlantic, killing many of his closest friends. Sitting unnoticed at the back of the room was Stuart Tootal, a former Army colonel and author who had first met Splash at the Army's reconnaissance school in 1990. Even then, Splash's reputation preceded him. The Pebble Island raid, the helicopter crashes, the dead mates. But as Tootal later wrote, nobody really knew the details. The quietly spoken Gloucester man never talked about his experiences in the Falklands War, and none of them dared to ask. That silence was shaped by a later culture of special forces secrecy. After the talk, over beers, Tootal asked Splash if he'd ever considered writing a book about what happened. Splash eyed him across the rim of his glass. His answer, in full, was 2 words. The first was an expletive. The second was no. He eventually changed his mind. But when the manuscript for SAS Sea King Down was complete and submitted, Splash knew what was coming. The Directorate of Special Forces, DSF, was likely to take an interest. Splash expected some form of official displeasure, because the system didn't look kindly on blokes writing about their experiences in Special Forces. The men of D Squadron, 22 SAS, carried out one of the most important Special Forces raids of the Falklands War, the destruction of 11 Argentine aircraft on Pebble Island in May 1982, an operation that helped safeguard the British amphibious landings 6 days later. The raid succeeded. The action entered the record. But later, Special Forces secrecy helped keep first-hand accounts rare. The United Kingdom's Ministry of Defence introduced its blanket policy of refusing to comment on Special Forces operations in the late 1980s, during scrutiny over SAS killings in Gibraltar in 1988. That policy didn't exist when the Pebble Island raid happened. But once it hardened into doctrine, it helped pull older actions into a broader don't comment culture. The raid entered the public record in broad outlines: dates, aircraft destroyed, a sentence or two in campaign histories. But first-hand participant accounts remain scarce. Splash pushed back on that logic when his book was published. His view was simple. If the operations were decades old and nothing in the manuscript still compromised security, then shutting down veteran testimony made little sense. His reason for writing was simple. He wanted to set it all down in memory of the people they lost. To understand why that memory matters, you have to understand what Operation Prelim actually was, and why the British couldn't afford for it to fail. Pebble Island sits off the north coast of West Falkland, a windswept strip of land less than 10 miles long, home in 1982 to 25 people and roughly 25,000 sheep. It had a small civilian airstrip, 3 grass runways, the longest about 600 metres, plus a beach strip. And under normal circumstances, it was of no strategic value whatsoever. The Argentine military saw something different. On April 24, 1982, 3 weeks after their invasion of the Falkland Islands, they established Base Aérea Naval Calderón on Pebble Island's airstrip. A Skyvan transport from Stanley ferried in personnel and stores. The sheep shearing sheds were requisitioned. Within days, a squadron of T-34C Turbo Mentor light attack aircraft arrived. Then, after British Sea Harriers struck the airstrip at Goose Green on May 1st, the Air Force relocated its IA-58 Pucarás there as well. A platoon from H Company, 3rd Marine Infantry Battalion, about 150 men in total, including engineers and aircrew, provided garrison defence. 4 75mm recoilless rifles and ammunition arrived aboard the requisitioned Falkland Islands vessel MV Forest. The Pucarás were the problem. Built by Argentina's Fábrica Militar de Aviones, the IA-58 was a twin turboprop ground attack aircraft designed specifically for counterinsurgency work. It could carry machine guns, cannons, bombs, rockets, and napalm. Against troops in the open or slow-moving landing ships in San Carlos water, a Pucará could do catastrophic damage. The T-34C Mentors compounded the threat, armed trainers that could scout British naval movements and report positions. British task force planners were working toward an amphibious landing at San Carlos on 21st May. That date was non-negotiable. The Southern Hemisphere winter was closing in, and the carrier's operational endurance was limited. Admiral Sandy Woodward and Brigadier Julian Thompson needed the aircraft on Pebble Island eliminated before any landing ship entered those waters. An airstrike might have looked like the obvious answer. Instead, the planners turned to D Squadron, 22 SAS, already embarked on HMS Hermes. The operation was codenamed Prelim. It was, in the Mackay and Cooksey account, the largest and most ambitious airfield raid undertaken by the SAS in a quarter of a century. An echo of the regiment's original wartime role, destroying Axis aircraft on North African airfields in 1941 and 1942. The reconnaissance phase began on May 10th. An 8-man team from D Squadron's boat troop was inserted near Keppel Island, a smaller island just south of Pebble across a narrow sound. The men unpacked 2-man Klepper canoes and paddled through freezing, rock-strewn waters to reach Pebble Island's shore. The Falklands terrain offered almost nothing in the way of natural cover: low scrub, peat bog, wind-blown grass. Establishing a covert observation post without being spotted by Argentine patrols required the kind of fieldcraft that took years to develop. The boat troop dug in and began logging aircraft positions, garrison movements, and defensive dispositions, transmitting their findings back to D Squadron headquarters aboard Hermes. One of the boat troop members later recalled that rough seas forced them onto the alternative route and left the patrol a day behind schedule. They had not established the observation post on the first night. But by the night of the 12th to 13th of May, the team had moved into position overlooking the east end of Pebble Island, watching the area around Phillips Cove, the intended insertion point for the main assault. The patrol counted 11 aircraft. They confirmed the positions were real, not decoys. The message went back to Hermes. The mission was on. HMS Hermes was detached from the carrier battle group on 14th of May, accompanied by the Type 22 frigate HMS Broadsword as defensive escort and the County-class destroyer HMS Glamorgan for naval gunfire support. The plan called for 3 troop strength elements. Mountain troop would destroy the aircraft, a second troop would clear the settlement area, and a third would be held in reserve as a blocking force to prevent Argentine counterattack. From the start, the timeline was under pressure. Hermes had to remain within helicopter range of Pebble Island, which meant sailing dangerously close to the Argentine-held shoreline. She couldn't be caught there at dawn. A carrier is an irreplaceable asset, and the Argentine Air Force had already demonstrated with the sinking of HMS Sheffield on the 4th of May what a single Exocet missile could do. The raid window was brutally tight. Insert after dark, destroy the aircraft, extract, and get the helicopters back to Hermes before first light. Strong headwinds delayed Hermes's approach. Captain John Hamilton, the 29-year-old mountain troop commander who would lead the assault on the airstrip, had to compress the offensive window and rework the plan as the operation unfolded. At 23:45 hours on the 14th of May, 4 Sea King helicopters from 846 Naval Air Squadron touched down at Phillips Cove, 3.7 miles from the airstrip. 45 men of D Squadron stepped into the darkness. Each trooper carried heavy loads of weapons, demolition charges, and ammunition. A naval gunfire forward observer accompanied them, responsible for directing Glamorgan's guns onto Argentine positions. A member of the boat troop, one of the men who had spent days watching the airstrip, navigated the assault force to the target on routes they had already proved. The column moved fast across open ground in bright moonlight, the silhouette problem a constant concern. Corporal Geordie Wright later recalled that after the whiteout conditions in South Georgia, Pebble Island was expected to be a quicker in-and-out job, but nobody had much sense of the firepower waiting for them. HMS Glamorgan opened fire on the western side of the airfield first, suppressing the garrison and drawing Argentine attention away from the assault teams approaching from the east. The SAS then hit the strip, using demolition charges and gunfire to destroy the aircraft on the ground. The planes weren't parked in a neat row. The raiders had to move fast from one target to the next, smashing, blasting, and shooting their way across the strip while the clock ran down. Glamorgan's shells struck buildings, stores, and defensive positions, and the whole airfield lit up. The Argentine garrison didn't effectively engage until the SAS had already regrouped and begun their withdrawal. As the raiding party pulled back past the settlement, the Argentines detonated charges under the runway, apparently believing this was a larger assault on the base rather than a hit-and-run raid. Shrapnel from those explosions wounded one British soldier. The SAS returned fire with small arms and grenades. The wounded man was hauled back to the extraction point by his mates. The entire raiding party reached Phillips Cove on time. The Sea Kings lifted them back to Hermes before dawn. The damage assessment was comprehensive. 6 IA-58 Pucarás destroyed. 4 T-34C Turbo Mentors destroyed. 1 short Skyvan transport destroyed. The ammunition dump and fuel stores hit. 11 aircraft in total, roughly half the Pucarás the Argentines had on the islands. British casualties, 1 man wounded. The operation was over quickly. 6 days later, on 21st May 1982, the British amphibious force landed at San Carlos Water without interference from Pebble Island. The airstrip played no role in opposing the landings. The raid had done exactly what it was supposed to do: remove a threat that could have compromised the most critical phase of the entire campaign. A study on 20th century amphibious raiding published through the Royal United Services Institute noted that the Pebble Island raid served both a practical and a morale function. It lifted the spirits of the landing force before the San Carlos operation, while simultaneously demonstrating to the Argentines that their forward positions were vulnerable. Captain John Hamilton, who had led the mountain troop assault with such composure that night, was killed on June 10, 1982. He was controlling naval gunfire from a covert observation position near Port Howard on West Falkland when his small troop was discovered. Hamilton fought off superior numbers, covering the escape of one of his men, and was killed in the engagement. He was awarded a posthumous military cross. His citation praised his determination, character, and will to fight despite wounds and hopeless odds. His grave sits on a rocky inlet overlooking the West Falkland shore, one of the loneliest military graves in the world. Splash Aston survived Pebble Island. 5 days later, on May 19th, he was aboard a Sea King helicopter when it crashed into the South Atlantic. Many men were killed. Many of the dead were veterans of South Georgia and Pebble Island, men Splash had served alongside for years. Splash was pulled from the water, suffering from hypothermia and a suspected broken neck. He was evacuated to a casualty ship, and then he escaped from it. Desperate to rejoin his unit, Splash got off the vessel, made his way back to HMS Fearless, and walked onto D Squadron's mess deck. His best mate, known as Bilbo, greeted him with a dark joke about the South Atlantic swimming team. Splash went back into action. More operations followed, ambushing Argentine Special Forces on Mount Kent, spending 12 days concealed in observation positions on West Falkland, evading enemy search patrols by digging into sodden ground in freezing conditions. He fought through to the Argentine surrender on the 14th of June. And then silence descended. The blanket MOD policy on Special Forces, introduced after the Gibraltar shootings in 1988, created a framework in which the government would neither confirm nor deny SAS operations, past or present. There is no clear evidence of a Pebble Island-specific gag order. What came later was a broader culture of official silence around Special Forces. For the men of D Squadron, this created an odd situation. The Pebble Island raid was publicly known. It appeared in campaign histories, naval records, and popular summaries of the war. Historians wrote about it. Journalists summarized it. But the men who had actually carried the mortar bombs across open ground, climbed onto aircraft wings in moonlight to place charges, and hauled their wounded mate back to the helicopters were rarely heard in their own words. Stuart Tootal, the author who eventually helped Splash write his account, captured this dynamic when he looked back on their time at the Army's reconnaissance school in 1990. All the students knew fragments of Splash's background, the raid, the crashes, the dead mates, but not much more. Unassuming and reserved, the quietly spoken Gloucester man never talked about the Falklands, and none of them dared ask. That wasn't just personal reticence. It also reflected the culture that grew up around Special Forces secrecy. Splash had joined the Gloucesters as a 15-year-old boy soldier, served 12 years in the regular infantry, passed SAS selection in 1978, and served in Mountain Troop D Squadron during the Falklands campaign. He finished his military career as the regimental sergeant major at the parachute school, 39 years of service in total. And for most of that time, the institutional culture gave men like him little encouragement to tell these stories publicly. SAS veteran Alan Bell, another Pebble Island participant, eventually gave a presentation at Military History Night at the Royal Canadian Military Institute, describing his role in the raid. Accounts like that emerged only decades after the fact, adding detail to a raid that had long been known in outline. The contrast is striking. Operation Prelim was, by any military standard, a textbook success. 45 men inserted by helicopter destroyed 11 aircraft and vital stores, degraded a forward operating base, withdrew with one man wounded, and were back aboard their carrier before sunrise. The operation helped enable the San Carlos landings. It removed a threat that could have cost British lives and complicated the entire amphibious assault. The Mackay and Cooksey study of the raid called it the most ambitious SAS airfield operation in 25 years. The naval record logged it as a complete success. Historians consistently treat it as one of the standout Special Forces actions of the Falklands campaign. And for years, the men who did it were far less visible in the public telling than the operation itself. Splash Aston visited the Falklands again decades later, re-walking the routes he'd taken in 1982 as research for SAS Sea King Down. Tootal went with him. Seen in summer daylight by visitors carrying light day sacks, the ground looked very different from what the raiders had crossed at night in winter with heavy loads of ammunition and kit. They visited the cemetery of St. Martin's Church in Hereford, standing at the memorial wall that honours members of 22 SAS lost during the Falklands campaign. Tootal noticed Splash pause, just for a moment, barely perceptible, whenever the subject of the dead came up. He'd seen the same pause when they stood together at John Hamilton's grave on West Falkland, overlooking the inlet where Splash's troop had spent 12 days hiding from Argentine search patrols. Splash spoke fondly of Hamilton whenever his name came up. The young captain who had led the assault at Pebble Island and died 3 weeks later, covering a comrade's escape against impossible odds. When Splash talked about the hardest part of producing the book, it was the effort of reconstructing detail. In war, memory is uneven. People remember the same event differently. But some moments, he said, stayed with him in vivid colour. Firing a flare during an ambush on Mount Kent and watching the smoke trail lead enemy fire straight back to his position, curling into a ball as rounds exploded around him, certain his last moment had arrived. Or the Argentine helicopter pilot, whose mustachioed face and aviator sunglasses he could still picture as the aircraft passed directly over his hide position, not daring to move a muscle. What finally changed his mind about writing the book was the need to set it all down in memory of the people they lost. The military culture around Special Forces gave men like Splash little encouragement to speak publicly about what they did or who they buried. The policy was meant to protect secrecy. Its effect was to leave much of the personal record in the background. Pebble Island matters not because the British government literally denied the raid happened, but because a later system of Special Forces secrecy helped keep the men's own first-hand stories in the shadows. The operation appears in Falklands campaign histories. The detail of what it felt like to climb onto a pukara's wing in moonlight, or to haul a bleeding mate across open ground while a destroyer's shells shook the earth beneath your boots, took much longer to emerge. Splash Aston spent 39 years in uniform. He survived 2 helicopter crashes on a glacier, a midnight airfield raid, a Sea King ditching that killed many of his friends, and weeks of covert operations behind enemy lines. He knew that writing about it would likely bring official displeasure. The raid succeeded, the aircraft burned, the landings went ahead. The war was won. And the men who made it possible spent decades with their own first-hand version of it, largely unheard. If you found this story worth your time, subscribe for more.